Welcome to Navigating India. Today, I am joined by Kalpana Karunakaran, an activist, author, and an academic, to talk about her recent book, A Woman of No Consequence: Memory, Letters, and Resistance in Madras. This book is about life of Pankajam, who is Kalpana Karunakaran's grandmother, a woman who describes herself in her autobiographical narratives as a humble housewife tied to mundane work. But her life tells a far richer story. Pankajam is a voracious reader who sought freedom from a fractured relationship with her husband and who documented her memories time and again vividly and clearly, and who is shaped by a deep love for her children, a spirit of travel, and the friendships she forged along the way, and a quiet attentiveness to nature, birds, and animals. She, as Kalpana Karunakaran would describe, reinvented motherhood entirely on her own terms. We will also be asking questions in this conversation that sits at the heart of this book, which is, why does it matter to study the life of a woman like Pankajam, someone who does not fit neatly into the conventional subject of a feminist discourse? And we will also be talking about Kalpana's own mother, Mythily Sivaraman, who is a well known Indian women's rights activist, trade union leader, and a prominent figure in the Communist Party. And what it means for Kalpana to growing up among this wonderful women, her mother, grandmother, and also great grandmother Subbalakshmi. Kalpana, thank you so much for coming on the show. And I want to start by asking this. You are not just an academic who is teaching at IIT Madras in Department of Humanities and Social Sciences, but you are also an activist and an organizer who have been working for several decades in the field of gender equality, labor rights, and the human rights in the state of Tamil Nadu, and also came from a family of extraordinary women, from your great grandmother Subbalakshmi to your grandmother Pankajam and your mother Mythily Sivaraman. So, could you give us a picture of your family and upbringing, and how does your family influence your current trajectory in life? Throw some reflections on that.
Absolutely. Thank you, first of all, Rishi, for this opportunity. I'm looking forward to having this conversation with you. To begin with, reflecting a little bit on my family and the influence that my family has had on my trajectory as an academic, as a writer, as an activist as well. I should begin by saying that I was maybe a bit of a reluctant academic in the beginning, at least. So right after as soon as I finished my master's, which I did in JNU in modern Indian history. So essentially, I was a history major for my master's. I spent several years working full time with the Tamil Nadu Science Forum, which is essentially part of the All India People Science Network. And I think the reason that I did that was because I had this very unusual mother, and of course, also backed and encouraged and supported by an equally unconventional father. And my mother had always told me whatever I did in life, she wanted me to have a couple of years of ground experience in villages, doing some form of work. She didn't say it had to be political work or it had to be development work, but she was always very keen that India's social realities, I must immerse myself and I must always be acutely sensitive to India's social realities and India's contradictions. So that's, I guess, an inheritance from my mother. So when I wound up my master's, I think it was only natural that for a couple of years I worked full time with the Tamil Nadu Science Forum. My work was primarily organizing women into microcredit-based self-help group federations, except because it was the science movement, all these women had joined the federations through the literacy movement. And therefore, it had a very strong emphasis on rights, on action against domestic violence and other forms of violence that women faced both in public life as well as in private life, on building women's leadership capacities. So it was not just to give women some loans and let's forget about it, let's get the repayment back kind of a program. And in addition to which, I was also working simultaneously with women's health movements and women's and public health movements as well. Movements to strengthen the public health systems, to monitor the delivery of quality services in sub-centers and primary health centers. So essentially, health with a focus on public health and women's health, and microcredit with a focus on organizing women into these grassroots collectives, the self-help groups. This was the early trajectory of my life as an activist. And once again, I must say a little bit about my mother at this point of time, so you get a complete picture about her. My mother was quite the pioneer. She had spent about 6 years working and studying in the US, in the UN. She worked in the United Nations during the 1960s, and she worked in the Committee on Decolonization. And this was the period that African countries were winning independence one after the other. And my mother was drawn, therefore, to the ideologies of anti-imperialism, of national liberation. It was the decade of the 1960s, after all. She was in the US during a very important period in the history of the US. It was the years of the anti-Vietnam War movement. It was the years of Martin Luther King, followed by Malcolm X and the Civil Rights Movement. So all of this meant that my mother, Mythily was her name, and she was well known in Tamil Nadu as Mythily Sivaraman, that she developed a consciousness as a Marxist and an anti-imperialist. So when she returned to India, which was in 1968, towards the end of 1968, my mother began to work full-time with communist movements and left-oriented people's movements in India. She was active in organizing women workers, both in the formal sector, in middle-class offices, as well as informal sector women workers, women who are residents of slums around basic issues such as access to water, access to food, access to rations. She was a strong voice against custodial violence and police stations, and spearheaded a number of well-known human rights cases in Tamil Nadu. So when I grew up, essentially, I grew up watching my mother be a strong role model. I remember that from the time I was a young child, families and children who lived in the slum just behind our house in Chetpet in Chennai, anytime there was any form of police atrocity or water would stop coming in their areas, they would all gather and flock at our gate, pressing my mother to take the lead in resolving the issue for them. So that was my mother. And she was well known as a communist leader, a writer, a women's activist movement, and a very inspiring and approachable, very warm and generous human being who was a great mentor to a number of writers, artists, and journalists as well, to younger people as well. So all of this meant that I naturally gravitated towards some form of activism right after my master's. The inspiration was right at home for me, in my case. And a couple of years of full-time organizing work with the Tamil Nadu Science Forum, I think I felt that academic itch again. I wanted to get back to doing research. And I did my research, my PhD on microfinance, on self-help groups, asking some hard questions about self-help groups. Are they really all about alleviating poverty? Are they really all about empowering women? What is the claim here? What does the reality look like? Where's the disconnect between the tall claims around microfinance? By this time, I'd had enough of field experience and reading around gender, feminism, microfinance, etc., to have a very critical take on this entire self-help groups phenomenon, right? So that was my, let's say, my entry point. And then after that, after my PhD, I found myself and I did that in Tamil Nadu. So I kept up my work, my contacts with Tamil Nadu Science Forum. Meanwhile, I had also got involved with a large number of other development NGOs, women's organizations, trade unions, etc. And I continue to remain involved with a number of campaigns and activities around gender rights, gender equality, labor rights to this day, even as I teach and research in IIT Madras in the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences.
No, I want to ask a lot of questions, and especially I think I will have another episode with you to talk about the microfinance itself, your work in microfinance.
Sure.
But I think a couple of questions immediately, which is the fact that you said in the beginning of a conversation, you have an unusual mother and unconventional father. We spoke a lot about the unusual mother. Can we talk a lot about the unconventional father? Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. He was unconventional in the sense that, to an extent, he spent a couple of years in the UK because he was sent by the company for which he was working. He had a degree in engineering from Guindy Engineering College, which was then the only engineering college in much of Tamil Nadu. And so he was sent by his company, TI Cycles, to gain some hands-on experience and he became a Marxist in the UK. And he got involved with students' movements against racism, students' movements for labor rights. And this was when he spent a couple of years in the UK. So when he returned to Tamil Nadu and he returned to Chennai, he was working in the private sector. He was working with a company, the same company that had sent him because he was on a bond contract with them. But he was looking around, he was looking out for organizations here, for young people, for like-minded young people. He obviously wanted to share his ideological and political convictions with other young people like him. And he met my mother. And that itself was fairly dramatic because he had gone to some small store looking to buy bananas and a newspaper or something like that. And he found this journal, right? And this journal was called the Radical Review. So he picked it up, intrigued by the title. And it said the editor is Mythily Sivaraman, and it had her address. So then he went looking for Mythily. So later in life, when he was asked how he met my mother, he would always say, well, I went looking for her, as if that was the most natural thing in the world, right? And so when I said unconventional, they were unconventional in every sense of the word, Rishi. She was 2 years older than him, right? She was a rising star in the world of public life, in trade union politics at that point of time. She was a well-known face and a name to reckon with. She was a powerful public speaker. He was very much in the shadows, right? They were from different castes. And they were drawn to each other. And they got married, and he became her biggest support network. And something, so when I've written about my parents in Tamil, and I've said that, I mean, it's a man who all his life stepped back and watched his wife with admiration, right? So he let her be the star that she was, the radiant star that she was, right? And he provided all the infrastructural support that was required for Mythily to be comrade Mythily, right? So which is that he provided the household, and we had an open household. We had people coming home at night. Somebody would, as a young child, they would wake up in the morning to find two people sleeping in the living room, in the hall, because they'd come in the night. They would have discussions with my mother all night. And my father would go and pick them up from the bus stand, go and drop them, make sure that they were comfortable in the house, that they had food to eat. He would provide that congenial home environment. But apart, and of course, he was earning, he continued to work in the private sector, one company or the other. So that provided the financial support that enabled my mother to be a full-time political activist in public life. And to be a communist activist, then there was no income of any kind. The communists were never in power in Tamil Nadu, right? So all of this meant that she required support, and she could not have been who she was without this support. He was also very much her comrade in every sense of the word. They wrote a number of articles together, both in Tamil as well as in English. He authored some pieces along with her for the Radical Review. He was also keenly interested in politics, in the trade union politics of the age that my mother was involved in. And he remained her lifelong friend, her partner, her companion, and of course, her lover. So that was my unusual dad.
That's a very extraordinary story. I want to talk about your mother, Mythily Sivaraman, and the work she have done in the state of Tamil Nadu. But before that, Kalpana, right now you are the president of Indian Association for Women's Studies. Could you elaborate on the work of the association?
Yeah. So that's a professional association that was created in 1981-82. And so the origin of the women's studies is pretty much part of the women's movements in India. So from the 1970s onwards, at late 1960s, there was this sort of flowering of women's organizations in many of our cities. And the question of the symbol of the burning woman, the victim of the dowry violence, emerged in a very big way. And it was women's movements in India at that point of time that began to put pressure on the government for legal reforms that would allow dowry to be seen as a serious offense, or other forms of violence, and not just dowry violence, but other forms of violence that women were subjected to, other forms of discrimination, especially in employment and the labor market. So this was a period when women's organizations were blossoming all over India. At the same time, there was a sense that in order to understand what was happening in the development experience, where did women stand vis-a-vis men? And where did different classes and castes of women stand in the labor market with respect to legal rights, with respect to education, access to healthcare, access to all other forms of social security, etc., for women workers and so on, that we must research, we must carry on rigorous, systematic research to understand modern India and how modern Indian development was impacting the genders differently. And how in some cases it was deepening discrimination, gender discrimination. It was not closing the gap, it was widening the gap. And that was the birth of women's studies, really. So the Indian Association Women's Studies, one of the founders was Dr. Veena Mazumdar, herself a doyen of women's studies. So this became this professional membership-based organization. It was activists, organizers, scholars, many of them were professors, faculty, teachers, PhD students, MA students, writers, artists, and so on. Anybody interested in gender equality in terms of also thinking about what is this, what is the condition, what are the contradictions, what are we grappling with, and how do we resolve it? How do we approach what we call the women's question in India, the question of gender equality through a research lens. And so that the Association for Women's Studies has really grown from strength to strength. It's every 3 years we hold these massive all India conferences, which are platforms for researchers and students across the country to share and learn, share their research and learn from each other. And it's a democratic organization. So every 3 years we hold elections, and the executive committee is elected every 3 years in order to give different people the opportunity to be part of the leadership of this association. So I'm currently, for this 3-year period, I'm in the executive committee and I happen to be the president. I'm not the president for life.
That's very democratic of the organization. So what are some of the key concerns that the women's studies is concerned with currently?
Well, I would say that's so diverse, Rishi. It's hard to sort of summarize that. You'll find that research on women's studies right now spans pretty much every spectrum, right? Every dimension. It could be the economy. The economy, it's the question of why are women not in the labor force sufficiently? In terms of college education, the gap between men and women is closing. In fact, women are nearly 50% or perhaps even a little more than that of men in colleges, at least in arts and science colleges, if not in engineering colleges. But even so, the participation of women in the labor force, in the paid labor force, has really not picked up in a big way in India. If anything, there seems to have been a decline. So over the last 30 years or so. So what are the reasons? Why are women not seeking paid employment? Are they not finding paid employment? Is there a stigma still when women are seeking employment for many families, for many castes and communities? Is a working daughter-in-law a stigma, right? A source of stigma. So this is just one of the many questions that that has concerned women's studies scholars. Also, new forms of violence, reproductive violence against women, the constantly growing sex-selective abortions that we see, the whole question of social media, what is it, and women's representation in media as well, right? How are women's lives, how are gender issues being represented by all forms of media, electronic media, social media as well now, political participation in women. Why are women still not adequately represented in our parliaments and in our panchayats? So all of this, you find that all these concerns. And then, of course, the question of not just women, but people of all genders now. What about the forms of violence that transgender persons face? And different classes and castes of women, because you can't speak about women in the singular. We've never been able to speak about women in the singular. It's always been women of different class caste realities facing different forms of opportunities and different kinds of violence as well, right? Even as there is always the potential for solidarity. But that potential for solidarity across class and caste is not always realized. So asking that question, women often internalize deep hatred against women of other castes, women of other religions, right? Women can often internalize self-hatred, which means they are deeply abusive to other women in their own families, including younger women. So why are women transmitters of patriarchal ideologies? So how do we break this chain of transmission right? And we often find that women are the strongest agents of reproducing caste and class ideologies within families as well. Wherever in a state like Tamil Nadu, wherever honor killings happen, and that's of course the most extreme form of violence, you'll find that women of the boys, usually women of the girl's family, especially if the girl is of a more dominant caste, right, are also involved in violence against their own daughter and the partner she has chosen, right? So all these, I think, are the questions that women studies scholars, researchers, teachers, and activists are grappling with.
Kalpana, one of the things you have just said is about women showing hatred against women in their own families, in the society. So, one of the conversations I have with my friends is that their mothers don't like the freedom which the daughters are having because they couldn't enjoy the freedom themselves. What are your reflections on this particular perspective?
So, that's part of the story that it's a bit complicated between mothers and daughters always. In some cases, mothers often feel it's quite common for mothers to feel a sense that these are freedoms, this is mobility that they did not enjoy, that they were not allowed to have. So when their daughters reach for it, they are not always generous. They are less than generous. That happens as well. Of course, that's not always the case. You would find mothers also taking a strong position, some mothers, and saying that what I could not have, my daughter has, and I'm happy for that. And I want to expand the scope of her freedoms. But from a more structural point of view, women also buy very much into this whole notion of family honor, which is closely linked to caste honor, right? So there's always the great fear that their daughter is going to elope with, fall in love with, form some kind of an association with a man of another caste or of another religion. And women are always on the watch against that, right? Which means that they are policing daughters. Phone calls, their choices, who are you speaking to on the phone, why are you staying out late, who's that friend I saw you with, right? So it seems to be a paradox that they've experienced so little freedom, but on the other hand, they are the agents of oppressing their own daughters, right? But we see that fairly commonly. And in a way, it's hardly surprising, Rishi. It's not surprising at all.
That's an interesting perspective. One more aspect I want to talk about is the question of women's solidarity. So, in the contemporary times, what are the ways and forms in which women are coming together and standing up for each other?
I would say solidarity. I mean, in many different ways. In many different ways. For one thing, you would find that there is now increasingly, almost in every state, young women who are far more articulate, who have access to education, to networks outside their family, and who are eager to become part of campaign groups, small groups, or larger groups with each other. Sometimes it could just be a reading group, and extend solidarity to each other, right? In some cases, it's very, for instance, I'm part of a sort of a citizens protest group. We're all women who are primarily interested in the question of violence against women in public spaces. And in fact, we came together, although each of us has been active in many platforms earlier, but we sort of came together following the RG Kar rape in the Calcutta hospital, right? About 2 or 3 years ago. And when we organized a joint protest in Valluvar Kotam. That's one of the frequent sites of our protest here, public protest in Tamil Nadu. We followed it up with a series of recommendations that we presented to the Chief Secretary of Tamil Nadu, to the Social Welfare Minister, etc. And so sometimes it's a more activist-oriented kind of a group, right? It's a collective space, and every time there is something that happens either in India or in Tamil Nadu, we're constantly sharing news with each other. Who needs to be supported? Do we need to engage? What is the engagement? Is it a signature campaign? Should we go and should it be like a quick protest? Does it call for a meeting? At the least an online meeting, something or the other, right? So that's one form of solidarity that I find, of activism that I find is very widespread, and of course amplified by social media. We're all connected through WhatsApp. It's a WhatsApp group, right? Much of our organizing is online, constantly on social media, etc. On the other hand, it could be And this is not the only form. It could, and I find that such groups exist across the states, right? Different regions. Sometimes it can just be women who are part of book clubs, reading clubs, right? Reading in different languages, Hindi, Tamil, Telugu, whatever it might be, English, sharing stories with each other, reading life stories and life histories of women or other kinds of stories, right? And providing a sort of a support group to each other. So that's another form of solidarity also that you see, while it takes the form of a reading club. So it's currently, I think we're in a stage in which activism around solidarity and gender takes multiple forms. And that's always a good thing. It's not one single form at all.
Kalpana, a slightly sensitive and provocative question, because we have just talked about the RJ Kar case. Violence against women in India is ubiquitous, and it is a shame. Women are subjected to brutal forms of violence everywhere and every day. Now, what we see is when we look at the mass outrage against the cases of violence, there is certain geographical and spatial nature to it. Violence happen against women in certain places will create more outrage than the other spaces, like more if it happens in urban metropolis. If you take the case of Nirbhaya, or even if you take the Arjikar case. Now, is this a reflection of larger fracture within the women's question and women's solidarity?
No, I don't think there is a but I see what you mean in the sense that there's always see the India's middle classes are always likely to come out in large numbers when when an act of either killing or rape or sexual assault happens in the case of a woman without any known social identity, right? So especially if she is if she's known to be a Muslim woman who was attacked because she was a Muslim woman, or a Dalit woman attacked by dominant castes in her region, in her town, in her village because of her identity as a Dalit woman, then that does not elicit this kind of outrage and anger, right? So of course, yes. So what you're saying is true, that there is there's always a certain way in which India's middle classes are quick to gather around when they feel that this was a case of stranger rape, right? So it was not a form of caste violence. It can't be called a form of an attack on a woman who is being attacked because of her religious identity or her caste identity, right? So in fact, that's something that women's groups are the ones who are always out on the street for caste violence, etc., right? Who are the first to say that, look, the social identity of a woman who has been attacked is also important, because in this case, it is not just, a gender assault, it's also caste assault, and we have to look at what happens and why that has happened, etc. Women's groups and movements have been raising this voice since the 1970s and the 1980s. But today, to an extent, I would say, I mean, I see this also as partly as a positive trend, that so many people who were earlier, who would never sort of raise their voice for anything at all, are at least now coming out to the street, right? When there is a case, when it's either the case of Nirbhaya or the RG Kar case or so many other cases. And I also definitely see that as an opportunity, because you're then able to tap into those networks that are created and say that, look, it's not just this, the outrage must continue even when it is women who are far more socially marginalized, right? Or economically marginalized. So you're able to say that, you're able to activate those networks that are created. And therefore, I see it overall as a positive sort of a development, that over the last 10 years, certainly since the Nirbhaya case, you've had greater possibilities for urban activism. And it's not only women's groups, it's students, it's lots of young men as well who are drawn into these immediate, quick upsurge of action.
That is very interesting, Kalpana. We have spoken a lot. Now, I think I want to return to our conversation about your family and the book. Now, in the beginning of the book, you have mentioned that your mother, Mythily, took inspiration from her grandmother more than her mother, and her grandmother, Subbalakshmi. She has seen her grandmother as this feminist figure. So tell us about Mythily's grandmother, Subbalakshmi.
Yeah, so my mother Mythily's maternal grandmother, her name was Subbalakshmi, was a woman who was in some ways a very ordinary woman for her times. She had she was born in 1897, so she was married at 11 years of age. She had her first child when she was 13, and by the time she was 20, she'd had two more children and lost both of them. So it was she'd never been to school. So it was in some ways, a very typical life for a woman of her generation, born in a Tamil Brahmin family, right? A very orthodox family, and therefore the pre-puberty marriage. And therefore sending her off to her husband's home as soon as she came of age, and almost immediately the marriage is consummated and she becomes pregnant. The husband is about 11 years older than her. So you would, I mean, in this case, why was Mythily drawn to the life of this very, uneventful grandmother's life? Was because Subbalakshmi did not want to be a wife, a mother, or a grandmother. Subbalakshmi was, although she'd never been to school, she was a voracious reader. She would read the books that her older brother would bring home from his school and his school library and then his college library. So she was extraordinarily well read. It was not just literature, but a large diversity of other disciplines also that she was reading all the time, completely self-taught and there was self-schooled. There was really no formal schooling at all. And a woman who was deeply interested in politics. And I think that's what drew Mythily to her grandmother. Mythily was a political figure. And here she had a grandmother who wanted to be part of the national movement, to the anti-colonial movement. So the 1920s was when the non-cooperation movement was raging in the streets of Madras. And Subbalakshmi tried to, as far as possible, throw herself, escape the surveillance of her family and be part of, the protests on the streets until her family found out and withdrew her and confined her within the house. And she was a very unhappy woman. She wanted the life of activism. She wanted the life of an active political life, which she could not have. And she had a great deal of physical and mental illnesses through her life. And Mythily strongly believed that this was the outcome of being confined within the home, of being suppressed, of not being allowed to realize her potential. And therefore, Mythily was drawn to the figure of her grandmother because Mythily saw herself in her grandmother. Mythily herself, all her life chased her dreams and lived the kind of a life that she wanted to live, throwing herself into the left movements, workers' movements, women's movements, etc. Right? So therefore, the attraction of Subbalakshmi, attraction of Mythily to a figure like Subbalakshmi, her maternal grandmother.
Now, I want to pick up one aspect here, which is your great-grandmother did not have formal schooling. And your grandmother, who is the character of the book, Pankajam, also had only 6 years of formal schooling. But they became voracious readers, reading the literature around the world. Right? I mean, we will talk about what is Pankajam reading down the line. So they're voracious readers. And the Pankajam is also a writer in both Tamil and English, right? She's writing short stories and autobiographical narratives. So how did this education come? How did this self-education has come?
I think the trait of reading was passed on from mother to daughter, Rishi, and I think that was important. You would find that in the book also, I talk about how Pankajam's interest in reading was sparked by the fact that her mother was constantly reading books to her. And the mother and daughter were only 14 years of age apart, right? So they were really like friends more than they were like mother and daughter. And from the time that she was a very young child, Pankajam's earliest memories are of her mother reading books to her, telling her stories. So the world of stories, of storybooks, of characters, imaginary, was something that powerfully appealed to Pankajam's imagination. And then, of course, she joined school finally at the age of 10. So she's homeschooled by her mother till the age of 10. Because she's lived only in these small seaside villages along the Coromandel coast. There's no possibility, no question of schooling then. Finally, her mother then quite dramatically picks up her daughter one day, just escapes to the city of Madras so that she can put her daughter in school. And that's how Pankajam then becomes a student in the Lady Willingdon School of Madras. That's an institution that still exists in Madras and carries on its educational activities. And there, Pankajam talks about how there was a lot of the school library was, the most attractive part of school life for Pankajam. She was supposed to read one book every week, and she would end up reading 3 books. And it was all the classics, the world classics, Jane Austen, Little Women, L.M. Alcott, right? So all the classics of her, all the Victorian era writers of her age. And this was also a period that mother and daughter were both living in Madras for a 6-year period. So her mother would go to Madras University's library and bring home books. Or she would go to Connemara Library, Subbalakshmi, and bring home books to read, which the daughter would pick up and read as well. So you would find that books were coming into the household because of this mother's voracious appetite for books. Madras University, although she was not a scholar, but she got special permission from the librarian. And she got a library card made out in her name because the librarian realized that this was a very unusual woman who was just hungry for books, although she'd never been to school or to college. And it's that hunger for books, for reading, for knowledge that she transmitted to her daughter. And this was also a powerful bond between mother and daughter, their mutual love of books and of reading.
That is very interesting. I want to talk about the main character now, the Pankajam. So how come you actually want come to write about Pankajam, right? It is actually very interesting because in her autobiographical narratives that you have found, she finds herself calling herself humble housewife tied to mundane work, right? I'm a woman of no consequence, as the book title itself suggests. So Pankajam doesn't actually fit in the conventional feminist subject, even like her mother Subbalakshmi, right? So how did Pankajam become the protagonist here?
Well, I was actually, I must confess that I was not thinking about Pankajam at all. When I was thinking of writing a book, I was thinking of writing a book on Mythily, my mother. And Mythily was a woman of consequence. And I must say that I had this urgency, this frenzy to write about Mythily's life because she was losing her memories. It was Alzheimer's dementia. And Alzheimer's meant that it completely took away from her sense of who she was, of what sort of life she had led. And I think I was feeling that sense of grief and anger and loss. And the way I was dealing with it was writing about Mythily, speaking about Mythily. So I'd written short articles in English and Tamil about Mythily. And I felt I was ready to write a book about Mythily, a proper political memoir or a proper political biography as well. And I was looking for material in my house when I found this wooden box that Pankajam, my grandmother, had left for me, and on which she had written on the lid of the box, my writings for Kalpana. Now, I always knew I had this box. There was no surprise here. I knew that my grandmother loved reading and writing, that she'd written some poetry, some essays, some short stories, etc. So there was no surprise here. But I still opened the box, hoping there would be some material on Mythily or relevant to Mythily. Right? That's when I discovered Pankajam's autobiography. And I realized that she had been writing, Pankajam had been writing, my grandmother had been writing about her life from 1949 till 1994. So over 5 decades, 50 years. And she'd been writing in bits and pieces. All of it was in English. It was in the school notebooks and the college notebooks of her children and then her grandchildren. And when I began to read it, I realized I was fascinated by the story of this. She calls herself a humble housewife, She says, I've had such an uneventful life. Who am I? How dare I write about my life? What have I accomplished? I'm not a writer. I'm not a social reformer. I'm not even a society lady. She's writing all this in 1949, right? So that's obviously she has in mind all the heroic women of the national movement. And she can see that she's not one of them. She's had 5 children. When she begins to write, her youngest child is 9 years old. That's Mythily. Mythily's just been put in school. Mythily was also homeschooled for 9 years. Like Pankajam was homeschooled by Subbalakshmi, Mythily was homeschooled by Pankajam for about 9-10 years. Mythily finally is sent to school when she's about 10 years old. So by this time, then Pankajam feels that she's settled into this life of being a housewife, 5 children, unhappy marriage. And that's the moment when she begins to reflect on her life and to start writing about her life. And when I began to read, I realized that, oh my God, this is a writer. This language is powerful. it's so evocative. She's able to bring to life an era in history. She's able to bring to life the landscapes of the Coromandel coast of Madras presidency, the small villages in which she's growing up. Pankajam's father didn't want her to even go to school, but her mother wanted her to become a doctor. So you can imagine the kind of conflict at home, right? And so what I do, therefore, is I pick up the story in my book and I set Pankajam's story against the larger debates of that era. Debates about girls' education. Should girls go to school at all? Should they learn English if they go to school? Why should they go to school? What was the motivation or the intention, the rationale for sending girls to school? So I look at those debates, those large debates of the 1910s and the 1920s, and I'm setting against that the story of Pankajam and how she experienced school life and she finally enters school at the age of 10 in the Lady Wellington School. So basically, the story of Pankajam then becomes my entry point to examine some of the debates around girls' education and later conjugal life, conjugality itself, or the reform of conjugality as itself in some ways. And everywhere I find that her writing, her autobiography, so candid, so powerful, so moving, that I'm able to use it as a lens to address larger debates of her era. And that's how I approach this book.
So I want to talk about the memory aspect here. So in her autobiographical narratives, we see Pankajam mentioning that her memory is uninterrupted from the 6th year of her life.
Yeah.
And like storing everything vividly in the memory is both a gift as well as a curse, because some memories keeps on haunting us. And so can you tell us something about this, how she is wrestling with the haunting memories?
Well, I think memory is a really powerful, a powerful source material for me to have written this book. Because the book is very clearly Pankajam's memory of growing up in the Madras presidency, a memory of being a mother of 5 children, and of course, her childhood. And there's so much of it, apart from the loss of Caesar, her beloved dog, there is the loss of school life, the loss of school friends, there's the loss of her younger brother, whom she loses at a very early age to a childhood illness. And then she sees her mother's mind unraveling. Subbalakshmi's own struggles with mental health begin rather early in life. So it's so basically there's a lot of sadness in Pankajam's story. So you're right that not being able to forget is also a curse, isn't it? But on the other hand, she's a person with, she's a resolutely cheerful person, right? She doesn't let anything get her down. She's quite fiercely joyful. So her life, when she looks back on her life, she captures the moments of joy, the moments of resilience, the moments of resistance, and the moments of sadness. And that's life itself, isn't it? It's not just one or the other. All these things always flowing together. And she's able to, I think, do it precisely because, and I don't know how she does it. How is it that she doesn't remember? How is it she doesn't forget anything at all? Right? I mean, I was also amazed when I was reading her memoir, when I was reading her autobiography, her ability to recapture minute detail, right? And then, of course, to convert it into language, which is very evocative. And that's the second kind of, it's not just that she remembers, but she's also able to then convert it to language that is very appealing for a reader as well. So that's her gift, certainly.
Could you elaborate a bit about her love for animals?
Well, I would say it's all kinds. She grew up around horses. And she grew up around dogs as well. So there's this lovely section in the book in which she talks about how, as a child, she was in Yeluru. Yeluru is in Andhra now, and Yellur is what it was called in the British era. And she would climb a tree, and she would be sitting on that tree and looking over the compound which belonged to a local Raja. And that Raja or a local Zamindar, Bobbili Raja was what he was called. And all his horses would be released into that huge Maidan. And this girl, this 8-year-old, would be perched on that tree and fascinated, would spend hours and hours admiring those horses, right? And then he would have dogs. He was a great lover of dogs and of horses. And she would be observing every little detail of those dogs, and she would come back and pester her father to tell her to identify the different sort of breeds of dogs that she was encountering there. And then, of course, she also, father brings home a puppy that becomes her beloved dog that she then loses under very tragic circumstances. But Pankajam was also, apart from this, I think somebody who was deeply linked to every life form on the universe. She was a great lover of nature. So it was not just, it was birds as well. She was a great bird lover, great bird watcher. She was, and this, of course, this is again another, like her reading, this is a habit that she picks up from her mother, Subbalakshmi. Subbalakshmi trains her, gives her a pair of binoculars and shows her how to spot birds, how to identify them. And then that's a trait that she's passed on to a cousin of mine in the family, one of her grandsons. So a great lover of birds, a great lover of insects of various kinds, of plant forms. So there is that way in which Pankajam felt a kinship with all life forms in the universe. And I think that's what kept her a happy person right through her life.
Through the various troubles that she has been.
Absolutely. The sight of a bird on her windowsill could make her forget any unhappiness, any sorrow. And she would go chasing after that bird to identify it.
No, one more aspect which I really found interesting was while Pankajam wrote extensively her autobiographical narratives, she also wrote stories and fictional stories, but they are autobiographical in themselves, right? Which you have used an effective tool in your book, what you call the autofictional stories. Could you reflect on a bit about it? Why did she choose to write certain aspects about her life in form of a story, in form of an other story separated from herself and not an autobiographical narrative?
Yeah. So I think this is where it gets very interesting, because there are parts of her life that she finds very difficult to write about in the first person, right? And the autobiography is something that you own up to. It's your life story. And there she's very clear. This happened to me. I'm the protagonist. This happened in my life. But there was no language then. And even now, not many women have the language to be able to talk about matters of intimacy, of conjugality, of what happens in the marital bedroom between husband and wife. How many women are able to talk about, right? So Pankajam then, I found, was doing this very interesting thing, that everything related to her, her dream, her quest for romance, for finding a partner, a man, a mate, a real mate, a union with a companion, all of that, her longing, desire, all of it then, she writes about through the lives of these three characters, Meena, Lakshmi, and Kamala, right? Through these four stories, two of them in Tamil, two of them in English. And Meena, Lakshmi, and Kamala, as soon as I began to read, I realized they were all Pankajam. It's so clear to somebody who knows her that it's essentially her life story. But what was distressing, painful, or just too close to her to be able to talk about matters of sexuality, of intimacy, can be expressed as the story of Lakshmi and Ramanathan, right? Not Pankajam and Sivaraman. Sivaraman was her husband, right? So she can talk about what happens in Lakshmi's bedroom, what happens in the sex life of Lakshmi and Ramanathan. But she can't say, look, this was the story of my conjugal life, right? There's no way she can say that. But using this fiction, using the tool of fiction, allows her to write very candidly, openly, honestly, unflinchingly about every dimension of her married life. And I must say, reading her autofiction, which is her stories, her so-called stories, was really a shocker for me. I didn't realize that she was going to bear it all. I was taken aback, definitely.
So is it for her a form of documenting, or is it a form of self-discovery?
I think it was all that. It was catharsis. It was definitely catharsis, because her married life was, quite distressing. I won't get into the details for that. Authors, readers will have to read the book. No spoilers here. But so certainly there's always that element of catharsis when you're able to write or speak about something which is painful and deeply distressing. And for her married life was one of the most painful aspects of her life, was the husband that she was fated to have. So that's part of the reason that she was writing. The other part of the reason is also equally interesting. I think through her writing, through these stories of Meena, Kamala, and Lakshmi, she was asking herself the question of why could I not use my intelligence to turn around the bad marriage that I was destined to have? That's a question that she's asking herself. And you can see that it's working at the back of her head. That I'm an intelligent woman. I've had 6 years of school. I'm so well read. I have a good heart. Why could I not salvage my marriage? Why did I not have a happy married life? Why could I not reform my husband? Right? So that's the question that she's asking herself. No, clearly that question is haunting her. Where did I go wrong? What could I have done differently? What did I not do? And so that's the thing. Reading that, I realized that, my God, she did not accept her fate like many women do, right? Oh, I was fated to have this marriage. Now, let me just make the best of life. But she wanted to turn around that bad marriage. She wanted to make it a good marriage. She wanted to remake the man in her image, in the image of the man of her dreams, right? How many women of her era or even this era would say that they have the courage to attempt? But she had the courage to attempt that, although he was 10 years older than her. He had been to school, he had been to college, he was earning, right? All the economic power, all the financial earning, everything he had, right? But here was this woman who said that, no, I want romance and I want a partner, I want a companion, and I'm going to make you that companion. So she wasn't going to give up easily.
That is something very unlikely to even imagine now within the relationships that we are seeing. So I think that's very right. I think one more aspect I want to talk about, because you have brought out the reform. So 1900s, 1910s and 20s and 30s was also a period where there were a lot of reforms coming up in the society, especially in terms of women seeing themselves as citizens and equal citizens at the par with men. And what was interesting is, as a sheer coincidence, we see Pankajam marrying the same year the Sharada Act was passed. So could you reflect a bit about the Sharada Act and what impacts that it had in the society, and how was society responding to this?
So the Sharada Act that was passed in 1929 basically banned child marriage, prohibited the marriage of girls below the age of 14, then it was 14, and the marriage of boys below the age of 16, right? And Pankajam was, of course, 17 when she was married. So in any case, she was not too young for her times, right? But what was interesting about the Sharada Act that was passed then, that was a very interesting period, the interwar years between the end of the First World War and the start of the Second World War, because you actually had 3 All India National Women's Associations that were created at that point of time. There was the Women's Indian Association, there was the All India Women's Conference, and there was a third organization. And for the first time, you had actually women who had education, who were articulate, who were talking about the need to reform society in favor of women, right? It was not men and male reformers who were constantly talking about the need to reform women, but it was women who were talking about the need to reform society. So it was women who were, in fact, they call it women becoming the subjects of their own reform agenda, right? It's not that women were the objects and men were talking about them as if women were pawns who could be moved around on a chessboard. So then it's these women's organizations who were pressing the British government to pass legislation that would reform marriage, that would ban child marriage, right? That would ban early widowhood, that would offer a better condition of life for widows, right? That would provide education for girls, that would set up schools for girls. So women were getting engaged and passionate about reforming society, right? And I think that was a very important moment in history. Pankajam, of course, her circumstances did not allow her to be part of any of these women's associations. And that's why she says, I'm not a society lady, right? She's looking at those women saying, look, my circumstances don't allow me to be part of that. I don't have the education and I don't have the family support either. But even so, what is interesting is that at the level of her personal, you have these large debates about reforming conjugality, right? And the debates about reforming conjugality are, where is the women's choice in the marital relationship? It's women who are talking about that. Even the Sharada Act is concerned primarily with the capacity of the child, really 14-year-old is it's still a child, right? To biologically tolerate intercourse and then biologically tolerate childbirth. So it's really about the capacity of the body of the child to biologically tolerate intercourse. But you would find, and there were instances of young child brides who often died because of marital rape by their husbands, right? There are cases of that as well. So all of this then meant that this is a period where the reform agenda, that mainstream reform agenda of the nationalist leaders was really a very minimalistic agenda, right? It was not about autonomy. It was not about the woman's right to pleasure. It was not about a woman's consent within marriage, right? Any of those debates. But interestingly, we find that reflected in Pankajam's autofiction. Because in her autofiction, she's raising the question of what about my right to pleasure in the marriage? What about my right to romance? What about my right to consent or withhold consent to a sexual relationship? Right? Does a man get to commit marital rape because he's my husband? Right? So these are the questions that you find haunt her in her autofiction. And that's once again why I found it useful to sort of juxtapose the two. The larger debates about the reform of conjugal life, the inner domain of communities, right? Because the British government was also extremely apprehensive and wary about bringing legislation that would sort of reform communities. Because the idea was that men would get to rule over women in their communities, right? But now women were pressing for reform. And that was what made that era different. So it's that which I'm trying to capture in the book.
No, one more question which I found really interesting while reading your book was, as you also already mentioned, the All India Women's Conference, right? So in an earlier biography I read of Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, who was part of All India Women's Conference also, there was this question of how much can we push forward the reforms? Because is this a period of larger anti-colonialism? At the same time, you're looking at the colonial to make some reforms in the society.
Yes,
so it's a very
exactly.
thin line. So how was it being dealt?
Yeah. So there was, in fact, a very interesting, at that point of time, a book by Catherine Mayo, right? Yeah, and I think, so Mayo's book then is really, Mayo, in fact, writes about the condition of women in India, but she is clearly, her agenda is, her entire perspective is that women's condition is so backward, and that's why India is not capable of governing itself, right? So essentially, it's like it turns out to be an apology for imperialism, right? A justification in some ways for imperialism, which is why nationalist leaders hold meetings denouncing Catherine Mayo, right? Gandhi himself denounces Catherine Mayo because it's seen as an attack, really, on Hindu society. But what is interesting about the women's associations are that they are risking both. They're doing both things at the same time. They're saying that we want political rights. We want the right to govern ourselves, right? At the same time, we want reform in the condition of women, right? We want the British government to pass legislation reforming society so that the rights of child widows and young girls, etc., can be protected. But at the same time, we will not allow the British government to use the condition of women as a justification to perpetuate colonial rule. Right. So that's a position that is remarkably politically mature, isn't it? That you say that yes, we want to strike a blow for gender equality and for social reform at the same time as we want to declare our right to govern ourselves. So the British are not our saviors, right? So there is both those debates that they are, both those lines of argument that they are holding.
Now, again, taking a step back into the Pankajam's life, how was Pankajam's relationship with her children, especially Mythily and her son Sundaram?
Pankajam was a very strong ally of her children. She never sort of stood in the way of her children's dreams at all. In fact, when her son Sundaram wanted to leave the country and emigrate for a short period of time, there was deep emotional distress as a mother, especially as a woman who has a bad relationship with her husband. She didn't want to let go of her son because a son is an ally against a husband, right? But then she realizes that she can't stand in the way of his happiness, his dream, his quest is to make a life for him, to remake his life elsewhere in some other country, and she has to let him go, and she lets him go gracefully. And likewise with Mythily as well. In the case of Mythily, both her mother and her father, both of them, Pankajam and Sivaraman, the husband and the wife, have always been very supportive of Mythily's dreams. And likewise, when Mythily comes back from the US as a political activist and a communist leader, it's her mother who makes peace with her situation quicker than her father does. Her father takes his time. I mean, he also comes around eventually, but there is a period when, for a few years at least, Mythily is a single woman. She's not married yet. And she becomes this wanted communist leader, wanted by the police, right? And that's the period of time when there's conflict within the household, when her father doesn't want her to come back home and tells his wife, shut her out if she comes back late, don't give her food, don't let her inside the house. But then Pankajam waits up for her, lets her in the house, gives her food, makes sure she's comfortable and at home. And also then becomes a good friend to many of Mythily's comrades who start coming home. So that's Pankajam's relationship to her 5 children was always very close. And I think what I do in this book is also, Rishi, to show how she reinvented mothering. Motherhood itself became a democratic relationship. It's a relationship where she grows along with her children, where she is not an autocrat of any sort, right? She understands that teenagers must be dealt with carefully. All this understanding that we have today of teenage, etc., none of it was available in the 1950s, right? But that's the thing, she was remarkable. Reading books on parenting so that she could be a good parent, so that she could be their friend, and she could understand each child as a unique individual. Basically, one thing that she does, for instance, is to read everything that her children are reading, and then some more, right? And it's so interesting that all her children's interests in the universe, like her oldest son's interest in geology, comes from the mother, right? The other son, Sundaram's interest in travel, and as he says, my love of nature, my love of the universe, my love of birds and insects and the wild beasts comes from my mother, who taught me to love and appreciate every single life form on Earth, on this planet. So for every child, you would find that Pankajam leaves her imprint on the, on the consciousness of every child of hers by sharing her love of pretty much everything: science, geology, geography, literature, world literature, classics. There's nothing that she's not interested in, right? The question of evolution of humans. And if you look at what she's reading, you'll find that it's everything. The Himalayas, how are the Himalayas created? And then, of course, world history, history of China, history of Greece, history of pretty much every country, and world religions. So all of that, then she passes on to her children, talks about how much there is to learn, to know about the universe to her children, right? And I think that was the basis of her bond with her children, more than it was anything.
No, I really wish once I sit down in her library and look at all the various books that she have read in her time. Because you have mentioned about the travel, Pankajam is also a traveler, right? Could you explore a little bit on how these travels have impacted her ideas and perceptions? Because I largely want to understand how important travels are. Because right now, do we travel enough now? Or do we need to travel more? So on those ideas.
Yeah. So Pankajam began traveling rather late in her life, because as she writes, she was a woman without money or freedom or time, right? She was controlled by her husband, who also controlled the purse strings very tightly and who made sure she got nothing, not even bare household allowance, and all the time caregiving for her older parents, for her parents who were aging, which meant in effect she was a prisoner of her husband's household, right? But somehow then, and that's part of the story, is how she does manage to get away And she does manage to sort of make a bid for freedom. So she does travel in the world. Some of the travel, of course, happens after her husband dies and she's finally free. But some of it also happens in the much later years of her life, right? When her children, therefore, find jobs in other countries and they buy her ticket, and she's able to then use the opportunity that they provide to go and stay with them. And here's the thing, that when she travels, she's not a grandmother on babysitting duty, which is how you see Indian grandparents often, no? When they go to the US or any other part of the world, primarily concerned about, being good grandparents. But Pankajam was interested in seeing the world. So any country she would go to, any part of, whether it was Africa, it was Europe, or it was the UK, or it was the US, it was museums, it was bookstores, it was libraries, it was wild reserves, nature reserves, and it was villages, countryside. So trying to understand and explore every dimension of the history, the society, the culture of the new country that she was being exposed to for the first time. And for her, travel also meant, since she was somebody who was reading about the world constantly, that there were always gaps in her knowledge, right? So whenever she traveled, she would try and fill those gaps. She went to some conservatory, for instance, in Montreal, where her son was living in Canada, and she would make pictures, would draw sketches of the leaves of the flowers that she was seeing, and then she would come back, go to a library, and read about those leaves and flowers, right? Trying to understand exactly how is the flora and the fauna in this part of the world, how is it shaped by the climate here in Canada, right? So that's and constantly making these connections as well inside her head. And that's the thing that I think was travel was another way of growing for her. It was a form of growth. It was like reading. Why do you read? Why do you travel? Just to understand how diverse and how fantastic the universe is, and ultimately how little we know and how much more there is to know, right? And that's ultimately how bigotry breaks down, right? You can't be suspicious about the world. You can't be suspicious about other people, about other races or other castes or people of other linguistic groups, if you have such a curious mind, right? Every time you meet somebody who looks different from you in either skin color or language or religion, you want to understand that person, right? You don't want to shun that person. No, so that's the thing, and I think that's what. So it's the true spirit of traveling. It's the connection that we should all ultimately share. All our differences should just make the other person more curious and not afraid.
No, one more thing about her travels I really found interesting was she was also able to develop friendships. And I think an interesting character that we come across is her Russian friend, right? I might pronounce his name wrong, forgive me. Alexander Dubinsky. Is it correct?
Dubiansky. Yeah, Dubiansky.
Dubinsky.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
tell us about friendship. Like, I think that was one of the extraordinary stories I have come across.
Yeah. So she goes to Moscow because her oldest son is in Air India. He's working in Air India and he's posted to Moscow. So that's her chance to see the Soviet Union, right? So she goes twice to Moscow in the 1980s. I think once in 87 and once in 89 when her son is posted. He's the manager of the Air India unit in Moscow. And there she meets this Russian scholar of Tamil studies called Alexander Dubiansky. And Dubiansky is a professor of Tamil language and literature, teaching and working in the Moscow State University. And he had met Pankajam's son when he was trying to book a ticket through Air India, right? And that's how he met Pankajam. And immediately the two of them connected, right? So that was a spark. And Dubiansky was 30 years younger than Pankajam. And yet it became the most important friendship in both his life and in Pankajam's life. Because Pankajam was somebody, he was deeply interested in Sangam literature, the oldest sort of form of Tamil literature known and that is still preserved and recorded. But he found that Pankajam was so widely read that her knowledge of Sangam literature was excellent as well. And then he also found that she was deeply interested in Russian literature. The stories of Anton Chekhov, of Pushkin, Alexander Pushkin, of Tolstoy. So there was so much for the two of them to talk about. So whether it was Tamil Sangam literature or Tamil Saiva Bhakti poetry, So there's a lot of bhakti poetry, which is in praise of Shiva, Saiva poetry, which is also beautiful poetry, Tamil poetry. And he found that Pankajam was extremely well versed in Tamil Saiva bhakti poetry. So when the two of them got talking, they would talk about everything under the sun and they would never stop talking. And so it was a shared interest in books, in reading, in Tamil literature, in the Tamil classical literature, in Russian classical literature. And Dubiansky himself spoke beautiful Tamil. It was very chaste Tamil. It's the kind of Tamil that you read in textbooks, right? It's not the colloquial Tamil that we all speak on an everyday basis. So he and Pankajam were friends and became devoted friends. And in fact, she called him, her son's name was Ramachandran. So she said, you're another son to me, so I'm going to call you Alex Chandran, because he was Alexander Dubiansky. And I found his letters to her. I found 6 of his letters to her, all written in Tamil, right? In which, when I read those letters, I found that he was sharing everything about his life to her. In the 1990s, when he was writing, the Soviet Union was collapsing. And there was like literally blood on the streets, right? It was a form of society was collapsing, law was collapsing. And then he writes to her saying, how can I focus on my research, right? When everything around me, the world as I know it is collapsing, right? And you can see that his innermost questions, his doubts, his fears, his insecurities, he's sharing so candidly with her. Once again, in very beautiful Tamil in his letters. So that's, that's a part of this book, his unusual friendship.
Yeah, that's what we also get an insight of what's happening to individuals when these bigger revolutions are happening in the background.
Yeah.
That's a very interesting aspect. One more thing I want to talk about is as much as in her autobiographical narratives and fiction that is available, Pankajam is not just writing about herself, but we see some reflections on the larger social and economic changes of her time. There is an instance in the book where she also gave a Tamil speech for Radio Singapore when she visited Singapore in early 1966. Could you tell us about how she's viewing the society, how she's reflecting to the changes around her?
So Pankajam again is this person who is, when she looks at the world, which has changed so much from the time, clearly she's, in that speech that she gives to Radio Singapore, she's looking at the last 10 years in Asia, she says. So basically that would be 1955 to 65, right? And somehow she sees that decade as being a very important decade in terms of transformation of women's lives. And she clearly thinks that the world has changed enormously from the time that she was pulled out of school in the middle of class 9 against her wishes. She was actually pulled out kicking and screaming and to be married off the next year. And that was not very far away. It was about maybe 3 decades before, right? That happened in the year 1927. And she has a daughter who's in the year 1966 has just joined the UN, right? Who's living by herself as a single woman, unmarried. She's got a degree from the US. She's gone on a scholarship and she's now joined the United Nations. And so when she looks on that, and I was trying to imagine it from her point of view, the world must seem to be such a different place from the world that she had experienced, that she had known, right? The limited opportunities that she had. And therefore, reading her essay, I found that it's not just her life or her daughter's life. She's looking at social forces. She's looking at how women are now entering colleges. Parents are sending daughters to colleges because young men don't want to marry girls who don't have a college education, right? So it's called Kalyana Padippu. That is marriage, education for or studying for marriage, for the marriage market, to become eligible in the marriage market. But then Pankajam is saying, even if it is Kalyana Padippu, the girls don't stop with that. The girls are interested in independence. They are interested in acquiring reasoning. Paguttarivu, the word she uses in Tamil. They're independent. They're interested in leading autonomous lives. And if their parents want them to get married, they want to become autonomous. And that's what we must welcome. So so she is not, this older woman who's primarily interested in getting young women married off. She's saying how fantastic it is that today young women are studying not just to get married, but studying so that they can explore the world better, so that they gain self-confidence and courage, so that they can live by themselves and be independent. And how much the world has changed. And she's welcoming it wholeheartedly. And she's also looking at, she's been following, she loved sports as well, apart from science. So this is what made her unusual. She loved sports. She played all the sports when she was in school. And she's following women in sports. She's saying, oh, Mary Rajamani has done so well in the Asian Games. Look at her. She's beaten so-and-so from Japan, right? So you can see that she's an athlete and this was her record. She was a record sprinter. So she's writing about her. And then she's writing about, also in that speech, she's talking about how Soviet women are blazing ahead in the field of science. And Valentina Tereshkova has shot off into space. And so you can see that she is filled with a sense of wonderment at the world. And that all these, barriers and bastions are crumbling before her eyes. Sports, science, education, higher, employment. And she's saying, wow, fantastic. So basically she's saying, you go girl to the next generation.
I think she would have loved to live in that particular age, young again, looking at all the changes that are happening. How are Pankajam final years like? Do you like to reflect on that?
Very final years. I mean, from the time her 70s and her 80s, I would say, were a period when she felt relatively liberated after her husband passed, I must say, right? I don't want to mince any words here. Her personal liberation happened when her husband departed the earth. And those were also the years that she travels more. She goes to visit her children, like I said. Son is in the Soviet Union, another son is in Canada. And then she therefore uses that as an opportunity to see other parts of the world for herself, right? This is also the period that she becomes the kind of a grandmother that she was as a mother. She was a grandmother to me and to her grandchildren, which means once again with us, she is reading, right? She's teaching us, and in the process, she's expanding our mind, and in the process, she's learning and she's growing. And when I was in college, I found that all the the Katha prize stories, Gita Hariharan's book that came out then, or books like, women's writing in English, women's writing in translation, all that begins to get published in the 1990s. She's picking up my books and reading them. And I realized that only now when I was looking at her diaries, right? So she's reading all that as well. And therefore, literally till the day that she has her stroke, and it's her brain hemorrhage really that knocked out what could have been done. She would have just continued to read and to write and to explore the world. Sadly, she had a stroke in 1994. But until the moment of her stroke, I would say she was curious about the world. And when I was a teenager, when I was in college, she would ask me, so you have boyfriends? And you have these boys who come home. Which one is your boyfriend? What is it like to have a boyfriend? And not in the sense of, hey, do you have a boyfriend? Not like that. But what is it like? Just tell me. Like that. And so that was the great thing about her.
A very Gen Z grandmother.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
No, I think one thing which I really found interesting was that both your mother and grandmother, Pankajam as well as Mythily, have always documented everything. They kept all the letters with them so that it could be used as a methodological tool for the future. So, do they have a sense that they're leaving something behind? Because why I want to ask this question was as the book itself, Pankajam is a woman of no consequence, right? And why is it important for us to study women lives like this in a very anthropological perspective? What is your opinion as an academic?
I would say that because it's these so-called ordinary lives that can open out a world for us, right? And I think if we remain obsessed with the world of high politics, the world of achieving men and women, and now we have plenty of narratives of achieving women as well, right? Women who succeed in men's worlds or in public worlds, right? Whether this is enterprise or this is business or it's some government, right? The famous men and the famous women syndrome, then I think there is so much of everyday stories that we miss, that we lose. And Pankajam's story is one such story. And while it is the story of the everyday, doesn't remain a story that is, how shall I put it? It's not a story that is concerned only with family and household and the everyday management of a household, right? It's the story of a woman who's aspiring to know the world. right? And given the limitations of her circumstances, she could never completely break free of family or break free of her conjugal life, right? Given those severe limitations, she managed to know and understand and see so much of the world. And I think to document how that happens and how it is possible for it to have happened. In the case of this one unique woman, I don't think in my book I say that this is I would prescribe this for anybody. I would just say that here is an interesting story of how one woman, despite the limitations of her social circumstances, of her domestic circumstances, managed to live a very rich life. And that's because she invented for herself a kingdom of the mind that she, talks about and that she writes about. And I think it's important for us to capture how it is entirely possible for ordinary people, to men and women, and especially women whose entire lives seem to be hemmed in, by family and domesticity and children and grandchildren and housekeeping and cooking, and to show that their appetite, their capacity, their intellectual curiosity can be quite boundless to know the world, to understand the world. And I think that's what this book does in a way. And I think I'm hoping that somewhere it will make the readers ask the question of what about their own grandmothers and great grandmothers and aunts and great aunts, or even their mothers, right?
No, I think to paraphrase Virginia Woolf, I think it's a book about a woman creating a room for herself, right?
Uh-huh.
She's not asking the question of whether we should give a woman a room. She has created a world for herself. That's how Pankajam's story is very interesting. What are our next projects?
Ayo, I don't know, Rishi. Right now, I'm enjoying the fact that this book is out and that I'm, talking about the book. And I am just enjoying the fact that I'm talking to a lot of people like you. A lot of people I'm talking about my book in universities, in colleges, in women's studies departments, sociology departments, history departments. And that's taking the book out into the world is a journey, right? And the kind of questions I get, fascinating. I'm enjoying this journey. So the what next will be a question that I'll answer, but not right now, because I haven't figured it out myself.
Professor Kalpana Karunakaran, thank you so much for this candid conversation and for writing this wonderful book. But I also look forward to do some more deep diving episodes where we actually look into your autobiographical narratives and also talk about your work with the self-help groups in Tamil Nadu. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Rishi. Lovely talking to you.
Thank you.